The Extraordinary Phenomenon Investigations Council presents Epic Voyages. Come join us as we enter and experience the great mysteries of the world with tonight's host,
Pat Uskert.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Epic Voyages Radio. I am your host, Pat Uskert, this evening. And I want you all to relax and get ready for an epic hour and a half of a pretty amazing voyage we're about to take. Our guest tonight is Dr. Jan Holden, and the topic we're discussing is her area of expertise, NDEs, or near-death experiences. So we have Dr. Holden on the line with us. Dr. Holden, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Great. How are you this evening? I'm
good, Pat. How about you?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much. And I'm really excited about tonight's show because this is a question that probably haunts every, no pun intended, haunts everyone who lives, basically. What do we go on after we die? And it seems that you have an interesting body of evidence to indicate that we may in fact do that. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and your expertise in NDEs?
Sure. Well, I have always been interested in phenomena that can't be easily explained. And back in about 1978, I read Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, that he had written in 1975, and was really fascinated with the phenomenon of near-death experiences that he coined the term for in that book. And then about 10 years later, when I was doing my doctoral dissertation in counseling, I tried a few different things for my dissertation, all of which failed at one point or another, and then I decided to try something related to near-death experiences, and that worked, and I finished my dissertation and my degree, and then I took a position at the University of North Texas in 1988, and I've been there ever since. I started as an assistant professor and then up the ranks to associate and professor, and now I'm department chair, the Department of Counseling and Higher Education, and I've been studying NDEs ever since.
Oh, and how long has that been? How many years have you been studying NDEs?
Well, it's about 25 now. 88 to 2012, I guess, is 24 years.
That is a fairly sizable amount of time to be studying anything. So I imagine you've developed an expertise. We can pretty much agree that you are an expert on this.
I guess so, and I certainly haven't been alone in doing research on the phenomenon. And what I can really say I'm expert at is reviewing all the research that has been done, the vast majority of which other people have done. And that was the basis of a book that I was lead editor for in 2009 called The Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, 30 Years of Investigation. And my co-editors are Bruce Grayson, who's a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia Medical School, and I consider to really be the leading near-death researcher and publisher right now. And my other co-editor is Debbie James, a nurse educator at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. So we had a psychiatrist, a nurse, and a professional counselor come together to bring together really all the leading researchers around the world and near-death experiences to address the main ideas and review critically all of the research that had been done so far. And that's the basis upon which I have expertise, is mostly just being very familiar with pretty much all the research that's been done so far on the phenomenon.
So the research sounds like it's a pretty scientific body of evidence. These are scientific studies, correct? These are not mediums or psychics or anything like that. We're talking about doctors, psychiatrists, that sort of caliber of research.
That's
University
right.
level research?
Yeah, that's right. This is all scholarly research that has been conducted by about half medical people and half not. Like another leading researcher is Kenneth Ring, and he was a social psychologist. He has retired since then, but just to give an example of somebody outside the medical field who also has studied the phenomenon. And by 2006, there had been over 700 peer-reviewed journal articles, scholarly journal articles about near-death experiences, and including 65 studies in the U.S., Europe, Asia, and Australia, involving over 3,500 near-death experiencers. And the studies looked at either the near-death experience itself or the after effects of it, or both. So there's quite a body of scholarly research to base some generalizations on, about near-death experiences and their after effects. I can begin talking a little bit about what research has shown about near-death experiences themselves. And most of the research that has been done has been with people who were from the Western world and who were adults at the time of their near-death experiences and had pleasurable experience. And that means the experience was dominated by feelings of peace, joy, and love, things like that. And the experience can be understood as having sort of like two aspects. And the one aspect is the material phase, where the person is perceiving the material world. And then the other is the transmaterial or non-material phase, where the person is perceiving environments and entities that are not of the material world. And although these usually happen in that order, first the person's perceiving the material world, then they move to a transmaterial domain. They can really happen in any order, and sometimes they even overlap, like a gal who had her near-death experience in an operating room where she had the feeling of being outside of her body, watching the surgery from a position above, and there in the operating room were two entities that were, she said, just highly intelligent and communicated with through their eyes, with light through their eyes, and at one point sent healing light into the surgeons and through their arms and their hands and fingertips into her body, and she knew that she was going to heal from the injuries that she'd experienced. So,
okay.
Yeah, so these tend to be experiences that people say are just extremely lucid and either as real or more real than in the body reality. And so then that phase that I just described is sort of the out-of-body phase. Sometimes people feel themselves leaving their body. Sometimes they just find themselves outside of their body and are suddenly aware that they are. And typically they feel completely at peace and maybe have a sort of benign interest in what they're observing going on in the material world, usually the things around their body. and they usually recognize their body as their own, but they don't feel really attached to it. And sometimes they travel away from their body, and it's not unusual for someone, if they have this experience in a hospital, to leave the area where their physical body is and maybe see loved ones in a waiting room nearby, or even leave the hospital and kind of float through walls and ceilings and find themselves outside of the hospital looking down on the city.
So, Jan?
Uh-huh.
Jan, how can we know that these experiences are real? You know, some people say, well, this is all happening in their minds. You know, maybe these are brain chemicals that are producing some kind of reaction as the brain or body approaches death. How can we know?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very important question, because the after effects that are so powerful, and then what NDEs suggest about the nature of consciousness and the possibility of the survival of consciousness after death, you know, we certainly want to know if we're basing all of that on something that is real versus a hallucination or a dream or that sort of thing. And one bit of evidence comes from the experiencers themselves, who say they're just very adamant that what they experienced was just absolutely real and felt quite normal, even though in retrospect they realized it was exceptional. And they're just very convinced that it was real. But there's a phenomenon that I've been particularly interested in called veridical perception. And
okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, veridical means like verifiable. And so people not unusually in their experience, they'll perceive things that, you know, once they're resuscitated and they regain normal consciousness, they report having perceived things that, based on the condition and position of their physical body, they shouldn't have been able to perceive, and yet it's later corroborated to be accurate. And so there are cases where, in particular, the person saw things that really contradicted what they would have expected or didn't seem to make sense to them, and yet later on, through investigation, it makes sense. So, for example, the gal I spoke about just a minute ago, who had suffered some serious injuries in a car accident and underwent surgery, she found herself outside her body just a few seconds before she saw and heard the monitor register that she was flatlining, you know, that she had no heartbeat, no respiration. Okay. And as they were busy resuscitating her, she then left the room and went out to an adjacent area, saw her mother literally on her knees praying, and her biological father standing next to her mother, but they had been divorced for a few years, and her mother was remarried, but she didn't see her stepfather. And the moment she thought, I wonder where he is, she zoomed to where he was elsewhere in the hospital, and she saw him putting quarters into a vending machine and vending out a candy bar. And she thought, that's odd, because what she knew of him was that he was a health nut and he never ate refined sugar, and yet here he was vending out a candy bar. When she regained consciousness, her mother was there, and just her mother, and as soon as she, you know, had her wits about her again and could talk, she told her mother that she had seen her praying, and she, even though her mother was praying silently, this gal Tricia could hear her mother's prayers, and that, of course, astounded her mother. But then Tricia very purposefully took on a kind of a scientist's frame of mind, and instead of saying what else she saw, she asked a leading question, and she said, where was my stepfather? I saw you there on your knees, and Dad was standing next to you, but, where was my stepfather? And her mother said, well, you're your father's and my child, and so we were kind of together in our concern about you, and the stepfather felt kind of like a third wheel, so he had gone off on a walk, and Tricia's mother said, "Oh, and you know what? You can't believe this. When he came back from his walk, he was eating a candy bar. I've never seen him eat a candy bar. Can you believe it?" And Tricia said, "I can," because she had seen it first.
So that's amazing. Here was a healthy man who almost never had snacks or candy bars.
Right.
And Tricia, who was supposedly dying, right? Dead?
Right.
Near death.
Mm-hmm. She was
saw
clinically
this.
dead during the time. Mm-hmm.
Clinically dead, and she saw this.
Right, exactly.
And
so,
would you... Yes, please, go on.
Well, it's just that her case is especially evidentiary because she saw something that contradicted her expectations, but was later confirmed to be accurate. And so it's not easy to pass off what she had believed she had seen as some kind of imaginings or just, the generation of expectations in her mind. And there's another case that my colleague Bruce Grayson was involved in investigating. He got a call one day from a nurse, and this is the psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, and the nurse said, we have a patient here who just regained consciousness after flatlining during surgery, and you may want to come and interview him because he had a near-death experience. So Bruce went over right away and interviewed him, and in the process of telling what he had perceived, the man said that, he'd found himself outside of his body in the surgery room, and that people were really kind of racing around, kind of urgent about that he had flatlined. And he said in the process that his surgeon was flapping his arms as if trying to fly. And Bruce thought, okay, that sounds a little odd. So Bruce went about interviewing each of the people who had been in the surgery room at the time, and what he got was the same reaction from everybody when he would tell them, the patient reports a near-death experience, and he said that Dr. So-and-so was flapping his arms as if trying to fly, and the person would say, and then they go, oh yeah, he's always done that, and then eventually Bruce interviewed the surgeon himself, and he confirmed that yes, it's his practice when he scrubs in to once his hands are sterile, he puts them on his chest. And then he backs into the surgery room and he stands there with his hands on his chest so he doesn't touch anything and contaminate his hands. And while the surgical team is doing all the preparation and he just stands there, and then when it's time for him to come and do his part, he steps forward and takes his hands down. Well, while he was standing there this time, the patient flatlined. And so with his elbows, with his hands still on his chest, but pointing with his elbows, he's saying, move that cart over here and do this and pick up that scalpel. And he's pointing with his elbows and flapping his arms as if trying to fly. So it's just a very idiosyncratic thing. Mm-hmm.
And it would have been, again, is another case where this person who is flatlining, shouldn't be perceiving anything, is actually not only seeing this, but seeing it from another perspective, maybe from above. Is that correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm, that's right. Most people report that their consciousness is in a location above the physical body, and if it happens in a room, they most often report being kind of at the ceiling corner, looking down on the scene. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So from that perspective, it looked like the doctor the surgeon was flapping his arms like a chicken.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Well,
And it was the kind of thing that everybody knew that the surgeon did this, but he'd been doing it for years, and nobody really even thought about it anymore. It was just just something he did. But of course, for the patient who had never seen anything like that before, it really stuck out in his mind. And so this is the kind of case where there have been a lot of attempts to explain near-death experiences in terms of physical processes. Maybe there's lack of oxygen to the brain, or release of endorphins in the brain, or the release of a chemical called DMT that has some effects somewhat similar to some aspects of near-death experiences. But the problem with all of those explanatory models is that they can't explain how someone could have this apparently non-physical veridical perception that clearly is not a hallucination, a dream, anything like that. And I did a little study of all the cases I could find in the literature that involved apparently non-physical veridical perception, and analyzed the frequency with which people reported things that later were shown to be inaccurate. And what I found was that the vast majority of the cases reported have absolutely no error, and involve these unusual things. Someone saw a penny on top of a cabinet in a hospital room. I'm not sure how the penny got up there, but when they checked it out later, the penny was there, and it was a cabinet that was high and above the level of anybody standing in the room.
Okay.
So there's just several examples of this that really defy the current scientific view that the brain produces consciousness, because these people were conscious and observing things when they were clinically dead, and their brains were showing no signs of activity.
Well, so if you're saying that the current scientific explanations for this, chemicals in the mind or DMT released in the brain, really wouldn't explain how someone would see a penny on top of a cabinet, their consciousness outside of their body, or their vision outside of their body. And if that is the case, what can we say it is? Or do you believe that consciousness can be outside the body?
Well, I have to first say that there's what research shows, and there's what I believe. And
okay. Let's go with research. Sure. What does the research show? And we can what you believe.
Research shows that apparently this can happen. That consciousness appears to be functioning apart from the brain, and so the prevailing Western view is that the brain produces consciousness, and that's called materialist or monistic thinking, that there's one phenomenon, and that's the brain producing things. And
that's the traditional Western view. That's how we explain the brain and perception. Okay.
That's right. And then the other view is dualism, or non-materialist philosophy, and that's the idea that when a person is alive, their consciousness and their brain, which are essentially two separate things, are very closely related, and that under extreme circumstances like being near death, consciousness appears to be able to function apart from the functioning of the brain, including when the brain appears not to be functioning at all in minutes into clinical death. So that's what NDE suggests. Now, the reason I'm a little cautious about differentiating science from my own personal conclusions is that from a purely scientific point of view, I don't think that near-death experiences can ever prove that there is survival of consciousness after death that goes on and on. Because the only people that have ever answered our questionnaires and our interviews are people who didn't stay dead. And
right.
I've tried to get the people who stayed dead to come and be interviewed and answer my surveys, but they just are very uncooperative. So, you know, from this really purely scientific point of view, we'll never know. But I can say that having talked with hundreds of near-death experiencers and interviewed several people in depth and read probably thousands of accounts, I've personally come to the conclusion that consciousness survives physical death. And there's just an accumulation of talking with one person after another, hearing one story of veridical perception after another that just has a very cumulative effect for me. And I think that anyone who has ever directly studied near-death experiencers, to anybody that I can think of who has directly studied near-death experiencers has come to this conclusion. And even people who really started out very skeptical come to be convinced. A case of that is Michael Sabom, who's a cardiologist from Georgia, did a study back in the early 80s and admittedly was not believing that he was going to encounter any consistent evidence, and he was completely his mind was completely changed by what he found.
So these are hard scientists, very serious medical doctors who have seen some of the evidence or experienced some things that they can't explain, and they are starting to believe that this is possible.
That's right. Yeah, they seem to shift to believing, instead of believing that the brain produces consciousness, that the brain is sort of like a cell phone, and it receives and transmits consciousness. And so that just like if your phone rings and you pick it up and you hear a voice, you don't assume that the phone is actually producing the voice. It's receiving and transmitting, sound, but it's not the producer of the sound, the original producer of the sound. And now somebody very naive who'd never seen a cell phone before might, come to that conclusion, but